The winter of 1884 had clamped its jaws around Arthur Prescott's isolated Montana ranch and refused to let go. Snow lay in deep, sculpted drifts against the north walls of the cabin and barn, the wind a constant, mournful voice that seemed to echo the hollowness within him. Arthur, a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape, moved through his days with a grim, practiced efficiency. His heart, he often thought, was a frozen stone in his chest, buried deeper than any winter frost. It had been 5 years since Martha and their little boy, Tom, had been taken by the fever, 5 years since laughter had last echoed in the small cabin, 5 years since love had felt like anything more than a cruel, remembered ache. He'd come to this valley seeking solace in solitude, a place where the vastness of the land might absorb the enormity of his grief. Instead, the silence had only amplified it. The ranch was functional, his cattle mostly well tended despite the brutal weather, his chores performed with a mechanical precision that kept his mind from straying too often into the shadowed corners of memory. But it was a life of stasis, a long, slow waiting for an end he neither hastened nor feared. His face, weathered by sun and wind, rarely softened from a stern, guarded expression. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a permanent chill. He spoke little, even to his horse, and the few trips he made to the distant settlement of Redemption for supplies were purely transactional. His interactions with others kept to a curt minimum. He had given up on connection, on warmth, on the very notion of a thaw within himself. The land was his only companion, and it was a harsh, demanding one. The blizzard arrived not with subtlety, but as a roaring white demon, blotting out the world beyond his cabin windows for 3 solid days. Arthur hunkered down, rationing his firewood, tending the small herd he'd managed to shelter in the lean-to beside the barn. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow into monstrous, shifting sculptures. On the 4th morning, the wind dropped to a malevolent whisper, the snow still falling but with less fury. He knew he had to check his fences, what was left of them, and see to any stray cattle that might have survived the onslaught. Bundled in layers of wool and hide, he ventured out into a world transformed, a landscape of blinding white under a bruised, leaden sky. It was near the creek line where the skeletal arms of cottonwoods clawed at the oppressive clouds that he found her. At first, he thought it was a drift-covered log or a fallen animal. Then he saw the edge of a beaded moccasin, a dark sweep of hair against the snow, the faintest rise and fall of a deerskin-clad shoulder. Caution warred with a deeply buried instinct he'd thought long dead. He approached slowly, his rifle held ready, though the figure was clearly incapacitated. She was native. That much was evident from her attire and features, even partially obscured by snow. He knelt, brushing the snow from her face. It was young, gaunt, and etched with hardship, but possessed a quiet dignity even in unconsciousness. Her skin was like ice. He felt for a pulse at her neck, thready, dangerously slow, but there. For a long moment, Arthur stared at her, the wind whipping his hair around his face. Every instinct for self-preservation, for maintaining the frozen solitude of his existence, screamed at him to leave her, to let the wilderness claim its own. It was not his concern. He had enough burdens. But then an image of Martha, her face pale with fever, flickered in his mind. He gritted his teeth, a muscle working in his jaw. He just couldn't. With a grunt of effort that was as much mental as physical, he carefully lifted the woman. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. He turned back towards the cabin, his boots sinking deep with each step, the wind trying to tear her from his grasp. The journey was arduous, each footfall a battle against the clinging snow and his own profound reluctance. This, he knew, was a disruption, a crack in the icy armor he had so carefully constructed around himself. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the stove was a welcome shock after the biting cold. He laid her gently on the rough-hewn floor near the hearth, not on his own narrow cot, an unconscious boundary already drawn. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at her, a stranger who had literally fallen into his life, threatening the bitter peace he had cultivated. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the otherwise silent room. He worked with a detached efficiency, stripping away her snow-caked, frozen outer garments. Her deerskin dress was worn, her moccasins thin. Beneath them, her limbs were like marble, cold and unyielding. He chafed her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, his touch impersonal, almost clinical. He wrapped her in one of his thickest wool blankets, tucking it tightly around her, then propped her head on a spare saddle blanket. He brewed coffee, strong and black, and when it was ready, he carefully lifted her head, trying to get a few sips of the hot liquid between her lips. Most of it dribbled out. Hours passed. He kept the stove stoked, the cabin uncomfortably warm for his own liking. He checked on her periodically, his expression unreadable. He saw the fine, high cheekbones, the smooth brow, the way her dark lashes lay against her skin. There were old scars on her arms, faint white lines that spoke of a life that had known its share of pain long before she'd collapsed in his snowbound valley. He found himself wondering, against his will, who she was, where she had come from, what desperate circumstances had driven her out into such a deadly storm. Late in the afternoon she stirred, her eyelids fluttered, then opened. Dark, disoriented eyes stared up at him, widening slightly with fear as they focused on his unfamiliar bearded face and the strange surroundings of the cabin. She tried to sit up, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. "Easy now," Arthur said, his voice rough from disuse. "You were near frozen, found you in the snow." She said nothing, merely watched him, her gaze intense and searching, like a cornered animal. He could see the struggle for comprehension in her eyes, the dawning awareness of her vulnerability. He offered her water in a tin cup, and this time she managed to sip some, her hand trembling as she weakly tried to hold the cup herself. He helped her, his large, calloused hand steadying hers. The contact was brief, functional, yet it felt strangely significant in the charged silence of the room. "What is your name?" he asked, more to break the oppressive quiet than from any real expectation of an answer. She looked at him, her lips parting slightly, then closing again. After a moment, her voice, soft and raspy, filled the small space. "Winona." "Arthur Prescott," he replied, a simple statement of fact. He saw no reason to offer more. The days that followed were filled with a tense, unspoken negotiation of space and presence. Winona recovered slowly. She remained wary, her movements quiet and economical, her eyes missing nothing. She spoke little, and only when directly addressed, her English hesitant but understandable. Arthur, for his part, maintained his gruff, distant demeanor, though he ensured she had food, broth, then stew, and kept the fire burning brightly. He slept on the floor by the door, his rifle beside him, a position that spoke of both protection and mistrust. He learned, in fragmented sentences, that she was Lakota, that her people had been scattered, that she had been traveling for many weeks, seeking a distant, rumored band of relatives. She did not elaborate on the hardships she must have faced, but her haunted eyes and the thinness of her frame told their own story. Arthur listened without comment, offering no judgment, no pity, merely the stoic acceptance of a man who understood that life was often a litany of sorrows. He found himself watching her sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking. The way her slender fingers mended a tear in her deerskin dress with a bone needle and sinew she produced from a small pouch he'd recovered with her. The quiet grace in her movements, even when constrained by weakness. There was a resilience about her, an unyielding core of strength that he, a man who prided himself on his own fortitude, found himself grudgingly respecting. One evening, as he was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are a sad man." Arthur's hands stilled. He didn't look at her. "Many people are sad." "Your sadness is a heavy blanket," she said, searching for the words, "like the storm." He made no reply, resuming his task with deliberate movements, but her words lingered, unsettling him. He had thought his grief was a private thing, locked away. That she could see it, name it, felt like an intrusion, yet also, strangely, a form of recognition. As Winona regained her strength, a quiet rhythm established itself in the cabin. She began to help with small chores, sweeping the rough-planked floor with a makeshift broom, tending the fire, her presence gradually becoming less of an imposition and more a silent companionship. She had a knowledge of the land that surprised him. She pointed out edible roots he'd overlooked, showed him how to make a soothing tea from willow bark for the ache in his shoulder. These small offerings were made without expectation, simple acts of shared existence. The harshness of the winter began to recede. The sun climbed higher, its warmth tangible. The snowdrifts slowly shrank, revealing the bruised and battered land beneath. Arthur knew that soon, Winona would be well enough to travel again. The thought brought a strange mixture of relief and an unidentifiable disquiet. He had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, to the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere from absolute solitude to a shared silence. One afternoon, he returned from checking his cattle to find her sitting by the creek, her dark hair unbound, washing it in the icy meltwater. The sun caught the blue-black sheen of it, and for a moment Arthur simply stood and watched, a feeling akin to warmth, unfamiliar and unsettling, stirring in his chest. It was not desire, not in the way he had known it with Martha, but something softer, a recognition of beauty, of life persisting in the face of hardship. He turned away abruptly, angry at himself for the lapse, for the crack in his frozen resolve. The day came when the passes would likely be clear enough for travel. He had mended her worn moccasins, provided her with a small store of dried meat and a sturdy blanket. He expected her to announce her departure. Instead, she asked, "You go to the town, soon?" Arthur looked at her, surprised. "Need supplies. Why?" I have a few beads, small things. Maybe trade for cloth, needles?" Her gaze was direct, a hint of desperation in it. He considered it. Redemption was a rough town, intolerant of outsiders, especially natives. Taking her there would invite trouble, scrutiny. His first instinct was to refuse, to tell her it was too dangerous. But then he saw the quiet hope in her eyes, the dignity with which she made her request. And a stubborn, unfamiliar protectiveness rose in him. He had brought her this far. He could not abandon her to the uncertainties of the trail without at least this small measure of help. "We leave in the morning," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. The journey to Redemption took the better part of a day. They rode in silence, Arthur on his sturdy gelding, Winona on the placid mare he usually used as a pack animal. He was acutely aware of the curious, often hostile glances they received from the few trappers and prospectors they passed on the trail. Winona sat straight and proud, her expression unreadable, but Arthur could feel the tension radiating from her. Redemption was a straggle of unpainted wooden buildings lining a muddy main street, its name a cruel irony for the hard-bitten souls who inhabited it. As they rode in, conversations died, heads turned. Arthur felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the old defensiveness rising. He ignored the stares, dismounting in front of Henderson's General Store, the largest and best-stocked establishment in town. "Stay close," he muttered to Winona, not looking at her but acutely aware of her presence beside him. Inside, the store was dim, smelling of dust, tobacco, and salted meat. Mr. Henderson, a portly man with small, avaricious eyes, looked up from his ledger. His gaze flickered from Arthur to Winona, lingering on her with an expression that made Arthur's hand clench. "Prescott," Henderson said, his tone cool. "Been a while. What can I do for you?" He deliberately ignored Winona. Arthur listed his needs: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. As Henderson gathered the items, Arthur turned to Winona. "Show him what you have." Winona hesitantly produced a small, intricately beaded pouch. Henderson barely glanced at it. "Ain't got no use for Injun trinkets," he said dismissively. A slow anger began to burn in Arthur. "It's fine work. Take a proper look." Henderson sniffed, but perhaps sensing a shift in Arthur's tone, he picked up the pouch, turning it over in his pudgy fingers. "Might give you a bit of thread for it. Not much call for this sort of thing." Winona's face fell, but she said nothing. Arthur felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "She needs needles and cloth, good quality." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "Generous, Prescott. She, your new housekeeper?" The insinuation was clear, and it hung heavy in the air. Before Arthur could retort, the door creaked open and 3 men sauntered in. Arthur recognized them: Bart Logan and his 2 loutish companions, known for their drunkenness and casual cruelty. Logan's eyes, small and pig-like, fixed on Winona, a leering grin spreading across his unshaven face. "Well, well, what have we here, Prescott?" Logan drawled, his voice thick with malice. "Didn't know you were partial to squaws." His companion snickered. Winona flinched as if struck, her dark eyes darting to Arthur, then to the floor. Arthur stepped slightly in front of her, his body tensing. "Mind your business, Logan." "Oh, I think it is my business," Logan said, taking a step closer. Don't like seeing our town dirtied by her kind." He spat a stream of tobacco juice dangerously close to Winona's feet. The air in the store crackled. Henderson looked nervous but said nothing, clearly unwilling to cross Logan. Arthur felt the cold rage he usually kept tightly leashed begin to slip. He thought of the years of solitude, the frozen grief, the careful emptiness he had cultivated. And then he thought of Winona's quiet strength, her resilience, the tentative trust she had begun to place in him. He thought of her gentle tending of his minor hurts, her voice soft as she spoke of the stars. "She's with me," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have a problem with her, you have a problem with me." Logan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Getting soft, Prescott, or just lonely? He reached out, as if to grab Winona's arm. It happened fast. Arthur moved with a speed that belied his solid frame. His hand shot out, clamping around Logan's wrist like a vice. Logan yelped, his grin vanishing, replaced by surprise and pain. "I said," Arthur repeated, his voice like chipping ice. "Leave her be." He tightened his grip, and Logan winced, trying to pull away. All right, Prescott, let go," Logan stammered, his bravado deflating. Arthur held him for another moment, his eyes boring into Logan's, then shoved him back. Logan stumbled into his companions, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This ain't over, Prescott," Logan snarled, but there was less conviction in his voice. He and his cronies backed towards the door, muttering threats. Arthur turned back to Henderson, who was now pale and flustered. "The cloth and needles, best you have, and I'll take that pouch back if you don't value it." His voice was calm, but with an underlying steel that Henderson clearly recognized. Silently, Henderson measured out a length of good wool cloth and produced a packet of needles. He accepted the coins Arthur laid on the counter without meeting his eyes. Arthur gathered his supplies and Winona's small pouch, then nodded curtly to her. "Let's go." They walked out into the watery sunlight, the eyes of redemption following them. Winona was silent, her head bowed. Arthur helped her mount the mare, then swung onto his own horse. They rode out of town the way they had come, leaving the whispers and hostile stares behind. The silence on the ride back to the ranch was different from the one on the way in. It was no longer fraught with unspoken anxieties, but filled with a new, fragile understanding. Arthur found himself replaying the scene in the store, the surge of protectiveness, the unexpected ease with which he had defended her. It was as if a dam had broken within him, a torrent of feeling he hadn't known he was still capable of. He glanced at Winona. She was looking at him, her dark eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. Gratitude, perhaps, but something more, something deeper. They reached the cabin as twilight was painting the sky in hues of violet and rose. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, the promise of spring. Arthur unsaddled the horses, his movements methodical, his mind anything but. He was aware of Winona moving about inside the cabin, the soft sounds of her preparing a simple meal. When he entered, the fire was blazing cheerfully, and the aroma of stew filled the small space. She had laid out 2 tin plates, 2 cups. They ate in their accustomed silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, imbued with a shared experience. After they had finished, and the dishes were cleared, Arthur found himself restless. He stood by the small window, looking out at the darkening landscape. "Thank you," Winona said softly from behind him. For what you did, in the town." Arthur turned. She was standing near the hearth, the firelight catching the gentle curve of her cheek, the quiet dignity in her posture. "They had no right," he said, his voice still gruff, but lacking its usual edge. "Few believe that," she replied, a hint of old sorrow in her tone. She paused, then added, "You were, like the bear, protecting its own." A faint smile touched Arthur's lips, a rare occurrence that softened the harsh lines of his face. "Maybe." He hesitated, then found himself speaking the words that had been locked inside him for so long. "My wife, Martha, and my son, Tom, they died 5 years ago." The admission hung in the air, raw and painful, yet also, somehow, a relief. Winona's expression softened with a profound, unspoken empathy. She didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply nodded, her eyes holding his, acknowledging his pain. "Grief is a long shadow," she said quietly. "It walks with you." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an imposition, not as a responsibility, but as a woman, a fellow traveler in a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. He saw the strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardships, the quiet wisdom in her eyes, the gentle spirit that had not been extinguished by loss or fear. And in that moment, the ice around Arthur Prescott's heart, an edifice 5 years in the making, began to truly melt. "I thought," he began, his voice raspy with emotion, "I thought I'd never feel anything again, except the cold." Winona took a step towards him, then another, until she stood before him. She reached out a hesitant hand, laying it gently on his arm. Her touch was light, yet it seemed to send a current of warmth through him, chasing away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. "The cold passes," she said softly. "Even the longest winter ends, spring comes." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then into her eyes. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Arthur Prescott didn't feel quite so alone. The cabin, once a monument to his grief, felt different now. It felt full. Hope, a fragile, tender shoot, began to unfurl within him. The days that followed took on a new color. The routine of the ranch continued, but it was no longer a solitary endeavor. They worked together, a quiet understanding growing between them. Winona's knowledge of plants and healing proved invaluable, and her presence brought a subtle life to the stark cabin. She fashioned small, beautiful things from scraps of leather and stone, her hands always busy. She taught him the Lakota names for the stars that blazed in the clear night sky, and he, in turn, shared stories of his boyhood in the East, memories he thought he had forgotten. There were no grand declarations, no sudden passionate avowals. Theirs was a love born of shared hardship, of mutual respect, of the slow, steady healing of two wounded souls. It was in the comfortable silences, the shared smiles over a hot meal, the way his hand would instinctively find hers as they walked by the creek in the evenings. One evening, as the first wildflowers of spring were beginning to dot the valley floor with color, Arthur found Winona sitting on the porch step, looking out at the mountains, now softened by the haze of new growth. He sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. "The land is changing," she said, her voice thoughtful. "It feels kinder." Arthur looked out at the familiar vista. It was the same land, the same mountains, the same sky. But she was right. It did feel different, less harsh, less empty. It felt like home, in a way it hadn't since Martha and Tom. He realized it wasn't the land that had changed, but him. Winona had walked into his life, a stranger lost in a storm, and in saving her, she had, in turn, saved him from the frozen wilderness of his own heart. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers interlacing with hers. She turned to him, her dark eyes luminous in the fading light. A question lay within them, and an answer. "Stay, Winona," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Stay here, with me." A slow smile spread across her face, radiant as the rising sun. "I am home, Arthur," she replied softly. And as the stars began to prick the darkening sky, Arthur Prescott, the cowboy who had once believed his heart to be irrevocably cold, knew that love, in its most unexpected and resilient form, had found him again. The cabin behind them, once a sanctuary of sorrow, now held the promise of a shared future, a testament to the enduring power of connection and the quiet courage it took to let oneself heal, to let oneself love, even after the harshest of winters. The land, once a reflection of his isolation, now seemed to embrace them, a silent, watchful guardian of the new life they would build together. A life where unexpected kindness had blossomed into a love as vast and enduring as the Montana sky itself.